This is the LatinNews Podcast. I'm your host, Richard McCall, currently in London, England. This week, we're going to be discussing Paraguay and recent events in that country. Our very special guest is Andrew Nickson, who is an Honorary Reader in Public Management and Latin American Studies at the University of Birmingham. He has been on the podcast before, perhaps he has a profound knowledge of Paraguay and that part of the world, and it's a great pleasure to have him back on the LatinNews Podcast. So welcome again, Andrew.
Thank you, Richard. Good to be with you again.
It's an absolute pleasure, and always fascinating to discuss Paraguay, perhaps one of the least known countries in South America, its landlocked status down there, and of course all of the international controversies, I would say, that surround it. And well, the president was just over in London, Peña. He was just giving a talk at Canning House. I'm sure you tuned in and saw what he had to say. But how do you feel about this? Let's go into the politics right now. And Peña's, let's talk about his successes.
Well, his successes are the successes of the macroeconomy. There's no doubt that Paraguay's economic growth in recent years has been above the Latin American average. It's forecast at 4.4% for this year. It's got good fiscal management, an exchange rate that's stable. In fact, it's appreciating against the dollar at the moment, which is rather unusual in Latin America. And the rate of inflation, the overall rate of inflation is fairly acceptable. It's less than 4%. The big issue in Paraguay today, without any doubt, the prime political issue is this disparity between the macroeconomic performance, which one cannot deny. It's not that people are saying that these figures have been made up, and the reality as felt by the vast majority of the population as being very increasingly difficult. And that is, for the first time for a long time, that is leading to a kind of bubbling up of anti-government sentiment amongst what I would say ordinary people who are not normally politically active. It's going beyond the traditional opposition critique. The opposition in Paraguay, relatively limited to urban middle class Asuncion residents. It's penetrating the rural areas in a way that for me is quite interesting and unusual. And it's come out as a result of statements that have been made in the past couple of weeks by leading members of the Cartes faction. Cartes is the former president of Paraguay, who is without any doubt the current political leader of the country. Santiago Peña is the government president. He travels very widely. He came to London, as you said, Richard, on his 48th overseas visit in less than 2 years since taking office. He must be one of the most well-traveled president in office anywhere in the world. And that has led to increasing criticism. Why are you abroad so often and not at home sorting out the country's problems particularly of the vast majority of the population? So it's come out in two particular, might seem almost rather simplistic statements, but they've had a major impact. One was a Colorado deputy, a woman called Rocio Abed, whose husband is one of Paraguay's of the big Itaipu binational hydroelectric project on a very high salary. And she said, what's everyone complaining about in Paraguay? If you want, you can go and see people eating cheesecake and latte cafe. What's this talk about? People suffering. And that led to a really quite surprising outburst on social media of criticism of him, with not just traditional opposition. This was coming from people living in rural areas. These were memes which were passed on. I thought that was very interesting. Then a few days later, one of the richest men in Paraguay, the top 10 richest men, who owns one of the meat packing plants, he said, well, yes, it's true that the people aren't eating the top quality meat because that's the meat that we export to the rest of the world. They should be satisfied eating meat on the bone, puchero, meat on the bone. And again, that received enormous criticism across the country as a kind of looking down on ordinary people, and that to me is something new in the political culture of the country. I've not seen that to the same extent as before. So that's the sort of superficial display of this discontent. But behind that, of course, is the fact that although the macroeconomic indicators are clearly good, or cannot deny that, and the quality of life of the vast majority, 80 to 85% of the population, has not reflected that macroeconomic performance. And that's why many of the commentators are talking about, there's one particular commentator talks about the heladera vacía, empty fridge, that people cannot get to the end of the month on such low salaries. The fridges are empty. The public transport in and around Asuncion is chaotic. People go to work 2.5 hours commuting like sardines in buses. The health service is highly critical, particularly for people who've got chronic diseases like cancer, for which the medicines are grossly inadequate. The education system is, even the government recognizes, one of the worst in the world. The PISA studies, the famous PISA studies that compare knowledge of 7 and 14-year-olds, revealed last year that Paraguay's students' knowledge of mathematics was the second worst in the world after Cameroon in West Africa. So these are things that are now kind of bubbling up to the surface, and it's affecting Peña's popularity. His popularity has declined. He's a very eloquent, bilingual, very handsome, young, confident president. But what's been happening in the past 6 months is a quite rapid decline in his popularity. And it's reflecting this disparity between, as it were, the two worlds of Paraguay. Now, we know that in Latin America, this is not something that's just confined to Paraguay, that this ambivalence between, because of the gross inequality in income of distribution and wealth distribution, but it's particularly pronounced in Paraguay because the economy is so highly based on natural resource extraction, soybean and meat, and increasingly rice, by the way. And they don't employ lots of people, to put it crudely. They're not labor intensive. So you've got at least 60, these government figures came out 2 months ago, 65% of the labor force are working in what they call the informal sector. And what that means is people working on the street or in very small and little business units. And these people are on extremely low wages, low wages. Only 50% of the population receive the salary, the minimum salary. So that's the background to what's happening in Paraguay today.
So it's those two events, the two statements made are the let them eat cake statements. And obviously,
yeah, exactly. Yes.
Have
yes.
riled.
In fact, one of the commentators did make that comparison. It's like it's like during the prior to the French Revolution. Although I don't think we're at that stage yet.
We're not there yet, but these set dangerous precedents. That what would you say? The lack of awareness of the ultra wealthy, those who continue to obviously garner more riches, and then of course the have-nots. That chasm is never a good thing. Obviously, very present in Latin America. Of course, when President Santiago Peña is over in London, he's talking, of course, about the positives: the economic stability, the fastest growth in Latin America, the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the region, stable currency, and the award of, for the first time ever, investment grade status. These are fantastic. But so you're saying really that what we see in that, I've just said, it doesn't reach the countryside and the people in let's say middle and then lower classes.
Exactly, it certainly doesn't. The government at the moment has what like conventional economics would call a very neutered conception of economic development. And this overemphasis on the purely factual macroeconomic indicators was something that was reminiscent of the kind of language economic that one got used to in the 70s and 80s. But frankly, economics, to be fair, has moved on from that. And there's widespread recognition now in the economics profession itself amongst governance experts that the quality of life is not reflected simply by the growth rate of GDP. But it's almost like Santiago Peña and the Minister of Economy and Finance, Valdovinas, it's kind of, they don't get it. They don't get it. I don't know where their education as economists seems to have stopped frozen in the 1980s. To put it crudely, they're rather backward in their understanding or the perception of the relationship between economic growth and economic development and sustainability.
That's the huge difference. And of course, you mentioned previously as well, is that you said Cartes, former president, he's the man pulling the strings.
He certainly is. There's absolutely no doubt about it. One indicator of that is every year in Paraguay on the 15th of August, it is a 14th of May, sorry, it's a requirement for the president to give a statement to Congress on its performance. The day or 2 days before, he went to the house of Horacio Cartes to give his statement to the leading members of the Cartista faction that dominates the Colorado Party at the moment. And that was seen quite rightly as very indicative of where the power lies. And then he went a couple of days later and gave the same speech in Congress. There's absolutely no doubt that Cartes is the power behind the throne, extremely influential, probably now the richest man in Paraguay. Yes. He's under sanctions still from the United States. They have not been removed. This arose from an investigation carried out some years ago, which was sent to it wasn't a private investigation. It was carried out by a government body. The then head of the anti-drugs agency, Senad, sent to the money laundering agency, Ceprelad, a report detailing allegations of Carter's involvement in organized crime, money laundering, international terrorism. And that report was leaked to the press. And it is believed, rightly or wrongly, the timing suggests that there might be some truth in this. That was January 2022. In July of 2022, the US government introduced the first sanctions against Cartes and declared him a significantly corrupt individual, significamente corrupto. And then the sanctions against him and his cigarette empire widened over the years with further sanctions. The leaking of that report required the state to institute a formal investigation into Cartes. Mm-hmm. But during the intervening period, the government of Abdo Benitez, who during the time when this report went into the public domain, was replaced by the current government of Peña, who was absolutely beholden to Cartes. And so what happened to that investigation? It got stalled and stalled and stalled. And then just a few weeks ago, I think on the 9th of June, the Public Prosecution Service said, well, actually, we've looked at the evidence and we can't find that there's any truth in this, and we're dropping any charges against Cartes. We're bringing the investigation to an end. And that was perceived by the Cartista faction as confirmation that all these accusations had been made up. Now, the assumption was that if these accusations had been made up, then surely the US would have switched its position on Cartes and said, well, we're dropping these sanctions. And they have done, by the way, under the Maginsky Act, they have done with some other people who are formally sanctioned, but they haven't. They've retained them. They've retained the sanctions. What Cartes has done in the intervening period, and I think unsuccessfully, when Peña came to power, was to strengthen relations with the US under the misconceived belief that the Trump administration, if we got closer to them, would drop these sanctions. And consequently, they've been extremely close to the US policy in the Middle East. They were one of only 10 countries in the world which voted against a ceasefire in Gaza. didn't abstain, voted against the ceasefire in Gaza in June this year. They're still one of only 9 or so countries around the world, the only one in South America, that has formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And I think they thought the strengthening of ties with the Trump administration would lead to the dropping of sanctions. But as we speak, those sanctions have not been dropped. If anything, they've been tightened. They've been tightened against his cigarette empire company called Tabesa, on the grounds that Tabesa had been illegally under the table funding money back to Cartes, because Cartes was sanctioned in terms of financial resources coming from Tabesa. That was the argument. But what the US authorities found out, rightly or wrong, was that despite this, Tabesa had been funneling money back to him and his family in a surreptitious manner. So they took further sanctions against Tabesa itself. Tabesa is not allowed to operate any longer in the US, and there's any companies that have links to Tabesa can around Latin America can be sanctioned. And the background to this is, as everybody knows in Paraguay, Tabesa and Cartes is the largest smuggler of cigarettes in the region, increasingly now in parts of Europe as well, parts of Eastern Europe. It's a massive enterprise.
Really?
But that's the background to the sanctions against Carter, but he still remains an extremely powerful person inside the country.
This makes for tremendously uneasy listening, especially the Cartistas and the Cartes clan out there. And Santiago Peña, I guess he basically ended up taking the State of the Union address, or the Paraguayan version of it, over to Cartes's house for approval and copy editing. I would have a copy approval and so on. Again,
we
very
don't know
uneasy.
That. We don't know that.
Let's suggest, allegedly. But yes, it certainly points in that way. And
yes, it's quite possible.
So
approval, yes, certainly.
Yes. The investigations that you were mentioning, of course, done by Osmar Legal.
No, that's a separate.
Oh. Let's talk about
Osmar Legal, by the way, is a rather controversial figure, because he was one of the investigators. This is before he was one of the investigators who was involved in delving into the accuracy of this report that had been presented to the money laundering agency. But he and another public prosecutor, investigator, were removed from the case. And during the Peña government, he was promoted and became a judge.
Okay.
So he was removed from the case. And the view inside Paraguay is that he was paid off. So the question arises, this gets a bit complicated. Why is it that Legal was the person who was involved in another shocking case that happened in August last year, August 2024, when a Rada Party member of Congress called Eulalio Gomez was killed in his house by Paraguayan police. The official argument was that they went to arrest him for accusations of being involved, but the independent press said that that's not proven, that he didn't fire first at the police, that they shot him, and we don't really know what's happened. But what we do know is that after the cell phone of Gomez the content was released to the press by Legal, by the way, we do know that he had extensive contracts with military leaders, judges, public prosecutors, members of Congress, and leading known narcotics dealers in the area that he comes from, the northeast of the country, very close to the Brazilian border. So the killing of Gomez revealed in a kind of, I was going to say in a microcosm, but it wasn't a microcosm, because he was a very important kingpin in the narcotic business between Paraguay and Brazil, because I forgot to mention his main contact was with Cabeça Branco, who is one of the leading PCC operatives that operates across the border in the southern Mato Grosso state of Brazil. So he was very important. So it begs the question, why was he killed? You know, the order to arrest him apparently had only been approved an hour or so before the shootout. It all looked like not a botched operation. One interpretation was that it was not a botched operation. It was this guy, for whatever reason, who was a bit of a maverick figure as a politician, was perhaps going to put what was Queen's evidence or going to reveal something, that there was that it was the result of some major internal conflict within the narco clans that dominate that region of the country. So that's
1 hour.
Well, I think it was less than an hour. Yes.
It sounds like an incredibly efficient operation, if it were that.
Yes, extremely efficient. Yeah, it's too efficient. In fact, too efficient. I mean, the family are still pursuing a legal case, saying that he was illegally killed by the Paraguayan state to shut him up. That's what they're saying. But shutting up because of what? Because of why? Because they cannot deny, because of the content of the cell phone, they cannot deny that this guy was such an influential figure in the narcotics. And there were judges and public prosecutors and fiscales asking for approval from him and help from him to carry out illegal activities because of his position in Congress, that he could pull strings. And his case is a kind of dramatic example of how, whereas if we were here 10 or 15 years ago, we would say, as has happened in many countries in Latin America, that the narcotics clans are influencing the political system. But what's happened now in Paraguay in the past 5 years or so is the narcotics clans are operating within the formal political system. They hold office, particularly at the municipal and regional, the governorships level in the country. There are 17 regions in Paraguay, but also inside the national legislature. And he is a dramatic evidence of this.
So when Santiago Peña was addressing, the audience there in London, here in London, at Canning House, obviously he was painting the rosy and very positive portrait of Paraguay's successes, but the elephant in the room, as we see it, is what is his government doing to combat corruption and organized crime? What are they doing? Anything at all?
Yeah, firstly, you're right. No mention whatsoever of these issues. No mention whatsoever. He just paints an extremely rosy picture based on these macroeconomic indicators. But what is he doing to criticize, to counter? Very little, very, very little indeed. His hands are tied. And the commentators inside Paraguay, if you ask them rather than me as a foreigner, they say, of course, because he's beholden to Carters. He cannot do anything. He's formally the president, but he is, as they say in Paraguay, he's a presidente itinerante, the traveling president. That's his job, is to travel around the world to encourage foreign investment and give a very rosy picture. No, there is no marked evidence of a structural change in the approach to public policy making, because it would require. I mean, this is the deep irony here. Well, not irony, a deep structural issue. It would require cleansing the public administration of the endemic corruption and clientelism that is associated with links to the Colorado Party. What you have in Paraguay is, with some exceptions, you have a situation where at least 75% of the state employers in ministries, state companies, state bodies are members of the Colorado Party. In the Electoral Commission, the same. In the public prosecution service, in the Ministry of Justice, the same. You have even the share is even greater. And by and large, these people want to keep their jobs and are paid relatively good by Paraguayan standards, relatively good salaries with lots of benefits. In the teaching profession, you can retire by the age of 50 if you've carried out 30 or 25 or 30 years service. There are all sorts of benefits that reduce the criticism from within the state with regard to inefficiency and corruption. So, but the downside of that, of course, is that you have a very lackadaisical educational system because of the poor quality and the poor performance of teachers, and similarly in the health sectors right across the board in most ministries. So carrying out structural reform would require using the basis for a meritocratic system of public administration, selection on the basis of merit, promotion on the basis of performance, and removal on the basis of proven corruption. Those mechanisms do not apply in Paraguay. You have a civil service law, which is a good law that was passed in the year 2000. It's just been updated. It just came into force, a revised version, which is basically the same law. There's hardly any changes whatsoever. But it doesn't make any difference because it is simply not implemented. On the question of election by merit, what's happened is by presidential decree has overridden the provisions of the law, the previous and the new law, and saying, yeah, for another year or so, we can appoint people without, because we need to appoint people for whatever reason. So there are ways of bypassing these laws. And in some cases, even when those attempts to bypass the law are not used, the law itself is simply not implemented. The law is broken, and the provisions of the law that require already performance management of staff are simply not implemented. And until that is addressed, we are going to get this two-track Paraguay. You've got macroeconomic performance very good. You've got a bloated, even by Latin American standards, an extremely bloated public sector in terms of staff numbers. And there is a kind of an agreement, a tacit agreement between the leaders of the soybean production and exporters and the meat production, the cattle ranchers and exporters, not to interfere with this. Now, one might have thought, as has happened in many other parts of Latin America, it's the business sector which complains every day to the government. Why on earth aren't you kind of cleaning up the state, the bureaucracy? Why are you not sorting things out so we have a more efficient state? They don't do this. They don't do this. And my interpretation is the reason they don't do this, because it's almost like this is the price we have to pay. This is the price we have to pay for paying virtually no taxes on the export of soybean and meat, and minimal personal income tax, all sorts of fiscal benefits for that sector of the economy, which is the powerhouse that produces these good macroeconomic indicators based on the export of raw materials, of agricultural products. And until that changes, we're not going to see any improvement in the quality of life of the majority of the population.
So your success, you're a Paraguayan citizen, your success rests is entirely due to you being affiliated to the Colorado Party.
No, not entirely. I don't want to exaggerate that point. There are certainly private sector businesses that have very, very few links, but the successful private companies are companies that win contracts with the state. The corruption inside the Colorado Party penetrates the private sector through this unfair system of bidding for contracts and awarding of contracts, which are sometimes outrageously unfair. And it's that, by the way, which keeps foreign investors away. Foreign investors aren't stupid. The foreign investors aren't stupid. Some of them are. And they do look beyond the macroeconomic data. Macroeconomic data is important. Fiscal stability, of course, is important. But they also look at things like the rule of law and governance, about which about which the Minister of Economy seems to have no concern whatsoever.
So we have Santiago Peña has completed 2 years. He's got another 3 years. Too early to say whether
about to complete 2 years.
Okay, so yeah. Is it too early to ask whether the Colorado Party will stay in power in 2028?
This is the big question. Having addressed what's happening in the country, the only way out of this will be if that discontent begins to bubble above the surface and produce political change. Now, before the 2028 general election, we've got in November next year, we got local government elections.
Yeah.
And here we see the astute behavior of the Colorado Party, which is one of the most, in a way, most efficient as a political machine. It's one of the most efficient parties in Latin America, one of the oldest as well, and which has a sort of life of its own beyond Cartes. That's the important thing to remember. There's a life of its own beyond. If Cartes and Peña were to disappear tomorrow, the Colorado Party, I'm afraid, is not going to implode. But under the leadership of the current leadership, they are carrying out very clever maneuvers. They have removed the most outspoken and one of the most intelligent opposition leaders, who was a senator, a woman called Kate Gonzalez, on ridiculous grounds of corruption, on the grounds that one of her assessores went on holiday and didn't sign the sheet saying that she would be away for a couple of weeks. And she said, well, I took my laptop with me and I still did right. Even if one accepted that as an error, administrative misdemeanor, it is surely not a reason for removing her boss, as it were, the Katia Gonzalez from the Senate, which they did last year. And it did provoked an outcry from the European Union, I think even the US ambassador, but she's been removed. And she is hoping, by the way, to stand as the opposition candidate in the local government elections in November of next year. But more importantly, they are now attacking the leadership of the second and third largest cities in the country outside Asunción. Ciudad del Este on the Brazilian border, where an opposition mayor won the last local government and has carried out a fairly interesting, less corruption kind of management. His name is Miguel Prieto, and they have now removed him from office on the grounds of corruption. The audit commission has done an investigation and has come up with some administrative misdemeanors, which were probably accurate, but again, hardly grounds for removal. But under the Paraguayan law, all it requires is a majority vote in Congress, and they can be removed. So he's kind of suspended from office. They're hoping to regain control in the local government elections next year. And my strong belief, if I were a betting man, is they are going to do the same thing in Encarnacion, which is the third largest city on the border with Argentina, opposite Posadas, where the mayor has a man called Luis Yid, which is spelled Y-D, Luis Y-D, Yid, I think it's pronounced. And they are going to attack him with administrative misdemeanors, remove him or suspend him from office so that they can regain political control in the second and third largest cities to dampen the possibility of a growing opposition in the run-up to the elections in 2028. Many people say in Paraguay, and there's some truth in it, that political conflict in Paraguay doesn't take place between one party and another. So strong is the domination of the Colorado Party that political debate and conflict takes place within the Colorado Party, and the opposition. The role of the opposition is to align itself with one or other factions inside the party. There's some truth in that. And that could well happen. What we could see is a resurgence of an independent faction in the Colorado Party. Under the present system that came in with Peña, there's never been one faction. I don't think ever been a faction, except during the dictatorship prior to 1989. Under the Democratic period where one faction has had such total domination of the party. But that, I feel, is beginning to be questionable. That there are signs of fractures even within the Cartistas faction, despite the enormous money that he uses to keep people on board, paying under the table salaries to members of Congress. That could happen. And of course, the big problem for the opposition is they, with the exception of this man Prieto and maybe Yid in Encarnacion and Cati Gonzalez, there is no outstanding opposition leader coming to the surface in Paraguay. The opposition, traditionally linked to the former bishop Fernando Lugo, did very badly in the last national elections. They're very weak. Their representation in Congress is very weak, and they were grossly overtaken by a right-wing populist called Payo Cubas, who did extremely well. I think he got around 23% of the vote, which is unheard of in Paraguay. Now, many people would say that vote, the people who voted for Payo Cubas, who later imploded because of all sorts of questionable behaviors by his members of parliament, who many of them switched. One of them switched within 2 weeks to the Colorado Party when Cartes offered her money. I'm not exaggerating. That nevertheless, that is an incipient sign in 2023, when Peña came into office. That is a sign of an incipient, broader opposition or discontent inside the country. But I've monitored events in Paraguay long enough to know that one should never underestimate the capacity of the Colorado Party to overcome these kind of issues. I think they're going to be there for a long time, and we're not seeing the death knell of the Colorado Party yet, despite the lack of popularity of Peña, despite the endemic corruption, despite the possibility of growing conflict within the party itself. No, I think they're going to be there for a long time.
And so let's move on as we come towards the end of our conversation. But let's address the issue of ongoing cybersecurity attacks in Paraguay. To what can we attribute these attacks, which have really they brought things to a halt?
Well, yeah. I mean, to be perfect, I don't know an awful lot about this myself, but there have been 30 state bodies that have been attacked, 30 in the past 2 months. And the general consensus is the ability of the cyber hackers to penetrate these cyber is because the Paraguayan state is particularly weak in having a shield against cyber attacks compared to many countries in Latin America. Again, one could look at this sort of from a distance and say, well, what do you suspect? This is not surprising where you've got such a corrupt, clientelistic kind of shambolic state. That's the last thing that they're going to be taking seriously, the need to kind of modernize and protect state bodies. And what's interestingly is the company, the hackers, the team is called Cyber Team, and they have said publicly on their Twitter profile or somewhere, they said, well, we only really did this, for diversión. We're not doing this to get money. We're doing this to show how weak it's almost like there's a kind of political motive, and nobody seems to know who they are, but they're saying we're doing this to show how weak the state is in protecting personal data. As you said, lots of personal data have gone into the public domain, and that compromised many people because this information can be used by criminals to get numbers of people's identity card and addresses and bank statements and so on. And that's where we are now. I understand that there are 3 laws currently being considered in Parliament to tackle this, but I haven't seen any strong evidence of any strong action being taken by the state so far. There's a kind of paralysis. That in the past week or so, there haven't been any more, as far as I know, any more attacks. But over the past 2 months, yes, there have been 30 attacks. 30 state bodies have been attacked. Yeah.
And finally, let's get to the final issue here. What about the renegotiation of the Itaipu Treaty?
Well, this is without any doubt the most important public policy, or should be the most important public policy issue for any president of Paraguay. The treaty was signed with Brazil by two military dictatorships in 1973 for 50 years, in which the energy from what was, at the time, it was built the largest hydro project in the world, and is still the second largest after Three Gorges in China. The energy is shared 50-50 between the two countries. But if one country doesn't use all of its 50% share domestically, it is required to pass, and I use this word advisedly, because in the early years I got this wrong. I was going to say to sell it at a low price. The wording doesn't even use the word sale or price. To transfer the energy and receive compensation based on its cost of production to the other country, if it wants to buy it. Well, obviously we're talking about Paraguay passing it to Brazil. And for many, many decades, Itaipu Energy, coming from Brazil's own 50% share and another 40%, which came from Paraguay around that sort of figure, fueled industrial development, particularly in the Sao Paulo area, and was responsible at its peak for around 22% of all the energy produced in the Brazilian economy. That share has gone down. And the key issue for renegotiation is that that Paraguay should have the freedom to sell, I'm not being pedantic here, to sell its energy share if it wants to, firstly to third-party countries, to other countries, Chile, Argentina, wherever, or to Brazil at a price that reflects the regional market price for energy. And if it did that, it would get a lot more income, not more foreign exchange, massively more foreign exchange. This Paraguayan academic Miguel Cart, who's done a study on this, a most revealing study of how Paraguay has been dramatically abused by the Itaipu Treaty, and the book is going to come out shortly in Paraguay, and hopefully many people will read it. Anyhow, the treaty expired in August 2023, around the time Peña came into power. And before he came into power, said, yes, we're going to renegotiate the Paraguayan Treaty. Nothing happened. It was delayed. And then earlier this year, in March this year, it was revealed that the Brazilian government's intelligence service, ABIN, the Administración Brasileira de Inteligencia Nacional, had been spying on the Paraguayan negotiators. And this was revealed in the Brazilian press, by the way, not the Paraguayan press, when whistleblowers from ABIN revealed this. And it had been carried out during the Bolsonaro government. And then the same newspaper, a couple of months later, revealed that it had gone on during the early years of the Lula government, that it had actually continued the spying operation. And in response, the Paraguayan government removed its ambassador, brought its ambassador back to Asunción, but has not taken further measures. There we are, and that's the situation. The latest postponement, I mean, you don't have to go back into history, it's going to be boring, but it was postponed for a year, then 6 months. The latest postponement theoretically expired on the 30th of May this year. And it's still, the renegotiations have not continued. And many people in Paraguay, observers, people who've been tracking this sometimes for decades, are fearful that once again, the Paraguayan leadership is going to sell out to Brazil. We don't know that, but the continual postponement suggests it raises question marks. Why on earth hasn't Paraguay been pressing for these negotiations to be pursued and fulfilled in a manner which defends the sovereignty, the energy sovereignty of the country? And that isn't happening. Everything's still in abeyance. It's up in the air. We don't know. That's where we are now, on the 21st of July, several weeks after the last postponement expired. About this, the government says nothing. When Peña goes abroad, nothing. Nothing about what is the most important public policy issue in the country. Absolutely no doubt about that.
So he's very careful on what he mentions and very, very explicit on what he fails to mention.
Exactly.
As always, it's been an absolute pleasure to discuss Paraguay with you. Your knowledge goes far beyond that of anything I could hope for, because really we have had such a fantastic overview of what is going on in Paraguay at the present, in spite of the positives being sold, and of course that exists, being sold by the government out there, and in President Peña's 48 and counting trips outside of the country in almost 2 years. There are still many very, very concerning issues to be addressed in Paraguay. Can I say thank you so much to Andrew Nickson, who's an honorary reader in public management and Latin American studies at the University of Birmingham in England. Thank you so much for your time here on the LatinNews Podcast. Well, I've been Richard McCall, your host here. You're most welcome. I've been Richard McCall here, your host in London. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time discussing political violence in Colombia with Elizabeth Dickinson of Crisis International, Crisis Group in Colombia as well. She is the country lead on Colombia and, of course, the Andean region. This has been the LatinNews Podcast. I've been Richard McCall. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.